right, so good morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you all, and I thank so much the organizers for inviting me. I think this conference could not be more important and timely. If there was ever a time we needed to mobilize the planet and support some of the mobilizing that's happening, it's now, and I'm excited also to be able to share in some of the many activities that have been planned. This morning I've been asked to speak about the meaningful role of academic engaged and applied research and working with rather than on social movements. So that's what I'll be focusing on today. I've been engaged in participatory research with social movements since the early 1990s. I know, I look so young, right? I have always been drawn to ethnography as a method because I'm fascinated with culture, and I love immersing myself into subcultures and trying to understand what makes them work. This fascination probably comes from my own background. As Trude said, my mother was Spanish, my father was from the United States, and in addition to growing up in a household that was shaped by two very different cultures, I was raised in an environment that placed me in international and multicultural contexts from birth, and I moved to different countries every few years. And this provided me with a liminal position in every context, and I'm still liminal in every context. So I'm allowed entry, but I never fully belong in any space. Liminality is actually a key resource for ethnographers who are lucky enough to have that quality. If the environment that we're researching is too familiar, we don't tend to question or even notice many of the cultural elements and dynamics that shape the environments that we're trying to study. At the same time, if we're too familiar to the environment and to others in that environment, they won't feel the need to articulate or explain their practices and actions. To do good ethnography, we need to both heightened critical reflexivity about the research environment and also just enough of an outsider status for people to want to explain and articulate what's going on in that research environment. My insider-outsider status has always helped me enormously in my work. It helps me see, it helps me research, and it helps me maintain a critical analytical distance. People have often asked me how it is that I'm able to gain access to the subcultural milieu that I study, which sometimes involves the organization of activities that need to be kept secret until such time as they're actually enacted. The answer to that is not too surprising, I think. I develop trust, which takes time, and I have a genuine interest in and concern for the people and movements that I study. I have sometimes been referred to as a militant ethnographer. While I'm very honored to be included in that category, the term itself is not one that I identify with, simply because the term militant is a bit too close to military for me. But leaving semantics to one side, I very, very much identify with what the term has come to represent in the tradition of activist scholarship to which it belongs. As editor-in-chief of Social Movement Studies Journal, I established the Jeff Juris Memorial Prize for the best article using ethnographic methods last year in honor of Jeff's work. The prize-winning articles are really wonderful, and you can check them out there on the Social Movement Studies Journal webpage. They should be open access. If not, you can get in touch. I'm sure that in every article or book, that acute analysis and theoretical brilliance need not be at odds with committed activism and committed and critical engagement with social movements. He demonstrated this in his own work, but he also furthered the case for what he did call and identify with as militant ethnography. So I'm going to use his words now to explain what he meant by this. So I start the quote now. My research has asked the following questions. What methods are most appropriate for studying social movements, particularly if we are interested in everyday activist practices, experiences, and subjectivities? What is the particular role of ethnography? How can we address power imbalances between activists and researchers? How can we make our research useful to the movements that we work with? What challenges and contradictions do we encounter when trying to conduct politically engaged ethnographic research? Throughout my career, I have developed and implemented a model of politically engaged participant observation that I call militant ethnography. Such an approach is meant to challenge the divide between researcher and activist, using my dual position as an organizer and anthropologist to not only gain access to movement networks, but also to generate deeper knowledge and more innovative theoretical insights about movement practices, experiences, emotions, and internal political struggles and debates than would otherwise be possible. Some of the challenges of such an approach include publishing in forums that are accessible to movements, negotiating heated internal conflicts, and finding a balance between political commitment and critical distance. End of the quote. So he said it perfectly. I subscribe 100% to this beautifully articulated approach. And in the time that I have remaining, what I'd like to do is share some insights from my own research to demonstrate how an engaged approach can yield rich insights for scholarship and activism. In the early 2000s, I was an activist and a researcher in the global justice movement based in Madrid, Spain. And for 3 years, I was actively involved in various activist groups in Madrid who were committed to global justice, to autonomous organizing, and to direct action. I was very interested in that time in developing a theory and understanding of autonomous movements, including the challenges and obstacles that activists faced as they tried to reach their goals for horizontality, inclusivity, diversity, and progressive action. I was also very interested in understanding how it was that such heterogeneous groups of people could nevertheless develop a collective identity that would sustain shared collective action over time. And as you can imagine, the insights from this research extend far beyond social movements. And I found myself over the years talking to people who I never thought I would talk to about autonomous movements and organizing. One of the most important insights that I developed has shaped my understanding of how to study social movements to this day. And that is to really question a tendency in scholarship to talk about movements in terms of successes and failures. The definition of success and failure in these cases is almost always imposed by the analyst from above, without considering what the participants actually understand to be a success or a failure. The limitations of this approach became apparent to me as a result of participating in a direct action that was organized by a short-lived group called the Disobedience Lab. The organization of this direct action was fraught with tensions and conflicts, debates, discussions, outright hostility in the lead up to this action. And the group was very short-lived because it wasn't able to manage these tensions. But it did manage to carry out this one direct action. Now, my own impression of this action was that it was a disaster from beginning to end. We never managed to enter and occupy the building. We never managed to raise the consciousness of the workers in the building. In fact, the only witness to the entire episode were the riot police who were waiting for us when we arrived, and one very drunk man who was sat on the curb drinking out of a bottle and who was unlikely to ever remember anything about it. After the action, such as it was over, the participants held their usual post-action debrief. I was amazed to discover that from the point of view of the activists, the action had marked a turning point in activism in the city, because for the first time ever, it had managed to bring together over 60 activists from different groups who normally didn't work together to engage in a somewhat risky direct action in the city. To them, it wasn't a failure, it was a success, because it enabled a strengthening of the social movement network itself. Now, if I had just applied my own criteria to that action from an outsider perspective, well, if I had been an outsider in the first place, not only would that entire action have been completely invisible to me, unless I happened to be drinking with the guy on the curb, I would have missed entirely the meaning and importance that that action had for the development of the social movement networks in Madrid at the time. I describe and develop an analysis of this in an article that you can read if you're interested. And although I do a lot more analytical work in that article than just talking about this point and this action, I do really call into question that tendency to characterize movements as failures or successes from an outsider perspective. And I instead argue that we can better evaluate groups and actions from the perspective of those involved in them. And that, as this example shows, even failures can lead to stronger movements, which is ultimately a form of success. I end the article by saying, movement success or failure is often treated in the literature as an all or nothing proposition. Either movements meet their objectives or they fail. These cases suggest that if our focus shifts from movement outcome to movement development, the relationship between failure and success becomes more complex and raises the possibility that scholars should consider what seems to be an oxymoron, the possible benefits of failure for social movements. So the bigger point is that that critique and that insight was only available and only possible through ethnography. Another profound insight about autonomous movement organizing and the role of information and communication technologies also came from that period of research. I developed this fully in an article called Unintended Consequences, with a very long title up there that you could read. And you can read it if you're interested, it's available. But the point of this is that although now we're much more critically reflexive about the role of technology in movement organizing, partly as a result of articles like this one, at the time that I conducted the research, movements and activists were really excited about the potential of the internet and ICTs to facilitate participation and to facilitate democracy in social movement groups. And very few were actually studying the real lived effects of the use of this technology on activism itself and on participation. Bear in mind, this research was conducted before smartphones and before social media, so it's focused primarily on the impact of email. But the insights from this research into email is still very valid, I think, and email does continue to be used so much in organizations. It's been one of the most resistant and long-standing forms of ICT communication. So, in any event, what I wanted to understand was the impact of use of email on the internal dynamics and on the sustainability and on the collective identity of two groups. And the important thing about this is that these two groups were committed to participatory and deliberative practices as a key feature of their collective identity, right? That's what they wanted to do. They were very reflexive about this. And what I found was that despite an explicit commitment to horizontalism, the use of email in these two groups actually increased existing hierarchies, it hindered consensus, it decreased participation, and it worked towards the marginalization of members of the group. In addition, the negative and unintended consequences of email use affected both groups independently of whether activists' evaluation of their experience in their face-to-face assemblies was positive or negative. So when one group it was positive and the other was negative, but the email was bad. It had all these unintended consequences despite these differences. And again, you can read the article if you want, if you're more interested in that particular insight. But the bigger point, again, is that I wouldn't have been able to discover this if I hadn't been doing ethnography and being a participant in the groups. And one of the novelties or innovations of the methodological approach that I adopted was to simultaneously do online and offline ethnography of the same groups. And then I also conducted interviews with participants to get at their emotional responses to the use of technology and to understand the factors that prevented them from participating. So often, research on social movements and research on online participation only looks at what happens online. Now, what's the problem with that? If you only look at what happens online, you're missing all the information about barriers to participation online. In other words, if you're only looking at people who are participating, you're missing the people who, for whatever reason, aren't participating. So if your goal is to understand what gets people to participate or how we can create a more inclusive, participatory public sphere online, just looking at what happens online is not going to get us there, okay? And this is also the case when people extrapolate from things like trending topics on Twitter to movement activity. Yes, of course, in one sense, being active on Twitter is a form of participation online. It can be seen as movement activity. But I've seen a lot of cases where groups manage to get a trending topic on Twitter, but no one actually shows up to the action on the streets. And that might have been the most important goal of that group organizing. So again, we have to think about this relationship between what happens online and what happens offline, because this can't be easily separated out. And this is also really true now because with smartphones, with Wi-Fi everywhere, movement assemblies have also moved to a form of hybridity, where the digital and the offline are entwined, just as they are right now. And the only way to fully capture these dynamics is to actually participate in these spaces. So while the insights were theoretically important, they were also of value to activists. And I noticed that the dynamics that I had witnessed in these groups was being replicated in other spaces I was involved with, in different cultural contexts, and also with really negative impacts. And so I did write a blog post about this, which you're also welcome to read, called Email Etiquette for Virtual Collectives. And a group of activist translators translated it into Spanish. So that's just an example of how we can make these insights available to practitioners and other non-academic audiences, which is a really important form of engagement that I think aligns really well with the theme of the conference, and it's part of what it means to be an engaged academic as well. I'm just going to give you one more example from my research, again from this same time period. And this time, it's based on an exploration of cultural barriers to transnational networking, which might be something that some of you might be involved in or hope to be involved in. You can also read about this research in this article, oops, back button. There we go, in this article in Antipodes. But I will just give you the takeaway for the purposes of this particular talk. The main insight for activists and practitioners here from this research is that failure to pay attention to activist political cultures can seriously hamper your ability to develop cross-cultural alliances in transnational networks. So I'll tell you a little bit how I came to that, and then I'll wrap up. In the cases that I studied, we start off with different groups of activists who are all committed to horizontality, they're all committed to autonomy, they're all committed to global justice. So the key thing here is not your classic divide between horizontal and vertical forms of organizing or logics of collective action, right? Here, the surprise comes from the fact that in theory, we would expect these activists to share a lot of common ground. And in the particular case that I explore, the activists in question had already agreed in principle to move ahead on a shared project before the meeting ever started. So the meeting was just supposed to develop and ratify this already existing agreement. So, once again, the key points to know about this meeting. They had all agreed on the consultation process and thought it was a great idea before they got to the meeting. They all agreed that the decisions should be taken by consensus. And although they spoke different languages, all of their languages had the word consensus in some form. So this meeting should have been a cakewalk, right? This meeting should have been just no problem at all. 5 minutes, we ratify, we leave. It was a disaster. It was a disaster. Why? Maybe some of you anthropologists can start guessing. Well, things began to unravel when all of the different activists began to put their consensus decision-making into practice. And guess what? It turns out that each of them had a different understanding of what consensus looked like in practice. For one group, it meant raising an issue and not moving forward until everyone agreed. But some of the other groups thought this was crazy. For them, consensus meant starting by finding what everybody could agree on at a minimum and building up from there. For yet others, consensus was only needed for binding decisions, not for each issue raised. The problem was that they each assumed that the other parties shared their common sense understanding of consensus. So they kept acting according to their cultural rules of the game. And they couldn't understand what the other people's problem was, basically. Tensions were high, frustration built up, anger ensued. They made the mistake of thinking that there's such a thing as common sense. They missed out the key thing, which was to take time to collectively decide which form of consensus, which form of methodology they would actually be using in that meeting. Now, the host group had spent a lot of time preparing that meeting, including the methodology, but they hadn't co-designed it with the other participants. And when they presented it, they met with extreme resistance because of differences in cultural practice. We are all trained to think that as rational actors, if there's clarity about rational objectives, we can effectively proceed on that basis. This is a huge mistake, because it overlooks the importance of cultural practice and how cultural practices are tied to emotions and to our feelings of well-being, of ease, and of comfort in spaces. So recognizing that there's no such thing as common sense means we recognize the need for reflexivity, to stop and question our assumptions and to be explicit about what we want to do, how we want to do it, and why we want to do it, and to develop a shared understanding of how to move forward that takes everyone involved into the process as much as possible. In my experience, the difference between effective and ineffective autonomous groups is that effective autonomous groups understand this and ineffective ones don't. Collective mindfulness does not rest solely or primarily on agreement on goals, but agreement on how to reach those goals. These need to be collectively agreed on, explicitly developed, and transmitted. Changing organizational cultures is very, very difficult, and it takes a long, long time. One of the hardest things about introducing change is overcoming resistance from old-timers or experienced members. At the same time, a sudden influx of newcomers who don't understand the cultural rules of engagement can also put a great strain on a space, and time needs to be taken to integrate them effectively. So there are just a few takeaways from autonomous groups that can help here, and I'll just share these with you before finishing. The first is making sure that those affected are really involved in developing any new strategy that you're introducing. And this works for organizations as well, not just for activists. Recognize that there's a problem or challenge and involve everyone in the solution. The second is to recognize the value of the work that everybody already does and their importance to solving the problem. And a third suggestion is to set a time limit on any change and promise to revisit it. So don't make the changes fixed and permanent. Be willing to experiment with a new role or strategy on a time-limited basis. But the other key thing, of course, is that for this kind of organizational culture to work, you need to actively build up a culture of trust. And that takes time, and it means involving people. What all of these examples show is that the greater the routinization of practices, the less our reflexivity about them. And here is where ethnographic work and engaged participatory research can be invaluable. I hope that these examples can provide some insights on how and why engaged research is important for scholarship and for social movements, and why adopting a movement-centered approach can yield a lot of value. And I hope that I've demonstrated why the world needs ethnographers and, of course, anthropologists. Engaged ethnography with social movements is not without important challenges, but rather than delve into these in my talk, I'm very happy to discuss them with you and any questions that you might have later in the question and answer time in the spirit of this engaged approach. You can find pretty much all my publications here if you're interested, but in fact, if you just Google me, there's podcasts, videos, articles for newspapers and all kinds of things. If you're interested, you can find me very easily on the web. So I wish you all a very fruitful, fun, and enriching conference. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and thank you so much for listening.